You often hear, well, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. We were justified in suspecting that the Japanese living in the United States would be aiding our enemy. Frank Knox, who was the Secretary of the Navy for President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was the first to put forward this thinking in an attempt to deflect attention away from the military's unpreparedness. In a widely publicized press conference not long after the Pearl Harbor attack, Knox publicly blamed Japanese Americans for secretly plotting disloyal acts against the United States. The FBI and Army intelligence knew that these were baseless allegations, but no one publicly disputed the claims of an important member of Roosevelt's cabinet. The media and politicians fed off each other's heated rhetoric. They whipped up a frenzy of fear that capitalized on prejudice that the Japanese faced from the time that they first arrived in the U.S. in the 1880s. Like the Chinese immigrants before them, the first Japanese who came to this country were laborers. They were considered unfit for citizenship. Japan's rise as a military power into the 20th century contributed to the Yellow Peril fears. The Immigration Act of 1924 barred any further immigration by Japanese laborers, and the first generation Issei, already in the United States, were prohibited from becoming naturalized citizens. Under Alien Land Law Acts enacted in the 1920s in the western states, the Issei were prohibited from owning land. And yet, by the 1940s, Japanese American tenant farmers were producing 40% of California's vegetable crops. Eager to get rid of their economic competition, the agriculture lobby, along with the anti-immigrant labor unions and the nativist organizations, seized the post-Pearl Harbor anti-Japanese climate to push for removing the Japanese from the West states. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which put in motion the forced removal of persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and their detention for the duration of the war. Justified as a military necessity, 2/3 of those incarcerated were U.S. citizens, the second-generation American-born Nisei. The U.S. government froze their bank accounts and wrested them from their homes, educations, and livelihoods under extreme duress. They were forced to sell their businesses, their belongings, even their cars, and their farming equipment for next to nothing. They even destroyed some of their treasured heirlooms from Japan, fearing that anything identified as distinctly Japanese in their possession would brand them as traitors. Taking only what they could carry, they were transported under armed guard to desolate locations in the interior of the United States. Men, women, and children lived in squalid conditions in hastily constructed government barracks, and the grounds were rimmed with barbed wire and guard towers with soldiers pointing guns at them. Young Nisei men volunteered from the detention camps to serve in the military, eager to prove their loyalty. Thousands more were later drafted when their military service became compulsory. Imprisoned with their families because they were presumed to be disloyal, the young Nisei men were considered loyal enough to be required to serve for the country that had locked them up. Together with the Nisei soldiers from Hawaii, the Nisei men from the mainland served in the bloodiest battles in Europe and in the Pacific Theater. The soldiers in the segregated 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Team served so valiantly that the unit has been recognized as the most decorated for its size and length of service in all of U.S. military history. At the end of the war, only 10 people had been convicted for spying for Japan. All of them were white. In the early 1980s, historical researchers discovered thousands of documents in the National Archives that proved there was never any military necessity for the incarceration. Moreover, they documented that the government lied to make their case that the Japanese Americans could not be trusted. Government officials, including Justice Department attorneys, purposefully suppressed, altered, and destroyed evidence that attested to the Japanese American innocence. They kept this evidence out of a definitive government report and from the Supreme Court that was considering these deliberations of the constitutionality of the government incarceration orders. In 1983, a bipartisan congressional commission found that the government actions resulted from racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Upon signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, President Ronald Reagan said, "Here, we right a grave wrong."